Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Karen Fligger, and I'm a Senior Project Manager with the WIFIA program. And I would like to welcome you to our first webinar, specifically about loans for state infrastructure financing authorities. I'm joined today by my colleague, Cortney Mukushi, who is a Senior Attorney Advisor to the WIFIA program. Cortney and I, working together with our colleagues and with input from the State Revolving Fund community, worked to develop this WIFIA program over the last 2 years. We are very excited to launch the new SWIFIA program this year and are looking forward to talking to you all more about it today. Before we get started, I will walk through a few logistics for today's webinar. If you're having difficulty hearing through your computer, you can call into the webinar at the number on the screen. In addition, we encourage you to ask questions at any time by typing them into your webinar dashboard. All participants are muted, so this is the only way to ask questions. We will take a minute at the end to look at the questions and then answer them. If we don't get to your questions in today's presentation, we will follow up directly with you by email. So just to walk through today's agenda, today I will provide background on how recent statutory changes impacting state infrastructure financing authorities borrowers and provide an overview of the loans that EPA will be making available under the SWIFIA program. Then Cortney will talk through the application process for SWIFIA borrowers. And finally, I will share the resources that EPA has available to prospective borrowers, and we will answer questions. Okay, first I'll walk through the statutory changes that happened in 2018 that specifically impact state infrastructure financing authority borrowers. So just kind of to make it clear, since the inception of WIFIA, state infrastructure financing authorities, or SRF programs, have always been eligible to apply for WIFIA loans. However, in America's Water Infrastructure Act of 2018, which we commonly refer to as a WIA, Congress made changes to the WIFIA statute that impact state infrastructure financing authority borrowers in general. And it also established a new loan program exclusively for these borrowers. Then in our FY 2020 appropriations, Congress provided a $5 million appropriation to launch what we're calling the SWIFIA program, so the State Infrastructure Financing Authority WIFIA program. So first, I'm just going to walk through general changes for State Infrastructure Financing Authority borrowers, and then we'll get into more about the SWIFIA program shortly. So the changes that impact all State Infrastructure Financing Authority borrowers who are coming in for a WIFIA loan under either of our options are that the statute changes the rating letter requirement from 2 to 1 final rating letter. It prohibits borrowers from using their capitalization grant that they get from EPA to repay a WIFIA or SWIFIA loan. It prohibits EPA from requiring new environmental or engineering review requirements for the projects that are funded. And it requires either EPA approval within 180 days of submitting a complete application or guidance on what is still needed to be approved. And it also requires that we identify the source of the WIFIA subsidy, so whether it's from the SWIFIA appropriation or the WIFIA base program appropriation in the loan agreement. As I said, we also launched a new loan program exclusively for State Infrastructure Financing Authority borrowers. And that's the one we're calling SWIFIA, and that's really our focus today. So I'm going to walk through some key changes and aspects of the legislation. So SWIFIA funds can only be made available if both the WIFIA program and both the Clean Water and Drinking Water SRF programs receive funding at the levels that are specified in the statute. So $50 million for the WIFIA program, and then kind of a formula for the SRF program. Since both those criteria were met in 2020, this allowed Congress to do an appropriation of $5 million for the SWIFIA program. So for SWIFIA loans, the projects receiving the sub-loans from the SWIFIA loan proceeds may receive 100% of the project cost. However, this does not change that the SWIFIA loan to the State Infrastructure Financing Authority borrower is limited to 49% of the SWIFIA project. The State Infrastructure Financing Authority borrower is responsible for repayment of the SWIFIA loan in case of a default on one of the subloans. And the State Infrastructure Financing Authority borrower may not pass the fees associated with SWIFIA loans to individual SRF borrowers. So WIFIA and SWIFIA, as part of that, is our federal credit programs, which allows us to leverage the federal appropriation. So Congress only needs to appropriate enough money to cover the estimated losses, and the remainder of the funding is borrowed from and repaid to Treasury. Because State Infrastructure Financing Authority borrowers are very low risk, the congressional appropriation can support a much larger amount of infrastructure investment. So, for example, in 2020, EPA received $5 million. This amount will allow the agency to make approximately $1 billion in loans. And because we can only fund, EPA can only fund 49% of the SWIFIA project costs, the total infrastructure investment that will result would be about $2 billion. So just to kind of make it clear, as I said before, state infrastructure financing authorities were always eligible to apply for WIFIA loans. So now you're really in a unique position because they now have two options for leveraging their programs with the WIFIA program. So State Infrastructure Financing Authority borrowers can take advantage of the new SWIFIA program, which is designed specifically for them, or they can borrow from the base program, like Indiana Finance Authority did in a loan that closed in 2019. So I'm going to quickly walk through the two programs and compare them. SWIFIA loans have a simplified letter of interest and a selection process where all eligible prospective borrowers will be offered a loan. All SWIFIA loans will be senior parity loans where EPA either accepts an existing indenture or the borrower accepts SWIFIA standard terms, which the standard terms are publicly available on the EPA website. And as a result of this kind of simplified options, we will have a streamlined and shorter underwriting process. Base program loans require submitting a more detailed letter of interest, and the selection process is competitive, and the top scoring projects will be invited to apply. So in this case, State Infrastructure Financing Authority projects would compete against, municipalities and utilities for the funds available in the base program. Points in the selection process are awarded as outlined in the Notice of Funding Availability and are developed to emphasize the agency's priority. Under the base programs, loans can be senior or subordinate, and the terms of the loans can be negotiated through a bespoke underwriting process. So they are really different programs in terms of the underwriting process. Both programs are kicked off by the issuance of a Notice of Funding Availability, which we did for both programs on the same date last week. And both will use, when you come to the second phase, they're both a two-step process with a letter of interest at the beginning and an application as the second phase. For the second phase, both will use the same application, but the letters of interest are different. And both can use the programmatic environmental assessment to satisfy the NEPA requirements. So just for the remainder of the presentation, we'll focus on SWIFIA loans. We do have several upcoming webinars that are about the base program. So if you are interested in kind of learning more about that program, there are two webinars being held on, one is held on July 28th and one is on August 11th, and they're the same presentation done twice. And I'll go back and provide a bit more information about those webinars at the end of the presentation. So now I'll just move on to the rest of this is just focused specifically on the SWIFIA loan program. So as SWIFIA is exclusively for State Infrastructure Financing Authority borrowers, the only eligible borrowers are state infrastructure financing authorities. EPA defines a state infrastructure financing authority as the state entity established or designated by the governor of the state to receive a capitalization grant provided to carry out the Clean Water State Revolving Fund Program or the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund Program. So this includes both the grant recipient and other organizations that help carry out that program. So if a grant is received by the State Environmental Agency and the loans are administered by a finance authority, both entities would be eligible to receive a SWIFIA loan, or either entity would be eligible to receive a SWIFIA loan. In terms of eligible projects, the eligible projects are obviously all the projects that are on the that are combined together for the SWIFIA loan must be eligible for the SRF loans. EPA has defined the SWIFIA project as all the SRF loans being included in the request for credit assistance. This includes both the SRF loans that will be financed with the SWIFIA loan, so up to 49% of the SWIFIA project cost, and the SRF loans that will be financed by other sources. The total SWIFIA project cost must be at least $20 million. So the eligible project costs are, development phase activities like planning and design, construction costs, the cost of acquisition of property, construction contingencies, capitalized interest and capital issuance expenses, and WIFIA application and credit processing fees. Those can all be included in the SWIFIA loan. So just some other important features to note. The interest rates on the SWIFIA loan are set on the date of closing based on the U.S. Treasury, state and local government rate of a similar maturity based on the weighted average life of the loan. So for the WIFIA program as a whole, since its inception, interest rates have ranged from as low as 0.83% to 3.36%. And I'm sure you all know that interest rates are very low right now. So if you had closed a 30-year term WIFIA loan yesterday, the interest rate you would have received is 1.3%. As I had said before, the WIFIA program can only fund 49% of the total SWIFIA project cost. The other piece of that can come from, repayments or other sources. The SWIFIA loan offers long-term flexible financing, so the loan term can be up to 35 years after first disbursement, and in addition, repayment can be deferred for up to 5 years following the first disbursement. And then the projects must be creditworthy, and so WIFIA determines this through its own credit analysis based on the information it asks for in the application. So just to kind of reiterate, our borrowers have found that the flexible financial terms available make WIFIA and now SWIFIA loans attractive. I've already mentioned the ability to have 35 years following first disbursement to repay the loan and the availability of a 5-year deferral period and the low interest rate. In addition, borrowers can have multiple disbursements at no extra cost. They can amortize their repayment schedules to complement other debt payments, and there's no penalty for prepaying the loan. Also, as I mentioned previously, the borrower must be creditworthy. So EPA will look at the structure of the proposed financing, the dedicated repayment source, the financial assumptions upon which the loan is based, and the financial soundness, history, and outlook for the prospective borrower to determine creditworthiness. Additionally, EPA is required to make a NEPA determination. Sorry about that. So EPA is required to make a NEPA determination. EPA is required to make a NEPA determination on the federal action, which is the loan to the State Infrastructure Financing Authority. To make this process easier, state infrastructure financing authorities can qualify for coverage under the Programmatic Environmental Assessment, or PEA. So to qualify for for coverage under the PEA, the projects must be within the scope outlined in the PEA, and appropriate supporting documentation must be provided. So this is part of the second stage, the application process. And then EPA can then issue a memorandum to the record noting that the loan will be covered, or the action will be covered under the PEA, and there's no kind of additional public comment required for the process. Similar to the SRF projects, SRF funded projects, projects under the SWIFIA loan must comply with Davis-Bacon, American Iron, and American Iron and Steel requirements. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Cortney to provide an overview of the SWIFIA application process.
Thank you, Karen. Okay. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Cortney Mukushi. I'm a senior attorney advisor here with the WIFIA program. So next slide, Karen. So now I'm going to walk you through the overall deal process, and in particular, the application process here at the WIFIA program, and specifically for SWIFIA. So within WIFIA, we divide the application process into three major areas: project selection, project review and documentation, and then closing. Project selection is the focus of today's webinar, and it is the first step in the WIFIA application process. It includes an announcement of funding, which has already happened, prospective borrowers, such as yourselves, such as some of you, which are representing SRFs, submitting a letter of interest, and then EPA selecting and announcing projects that it would like to submit a formal application. After that process comes project review, negotiation, documentation, and closing. At that point is when the SRF would submit a formal application and its application materials to the WIFIA program. From there, the internal teams at WIFIA, credit, risk, and legal, conduct their due diligence. Then it proceeds on to loan documentation and negotiation. And then we proceed to closing, which concludes when both the applicant, the SRF, and the EPA administrator sign the loan agreement and the term sheet. Next slide, please, Karen. Okay, so in this slide, I'll go into a bit more detail on project selection and the invitation to apply. The dates provided on this slide show the schedule that EPA is following for the 2020 selection round. The notice of funding availability, the NOFA, went out on July 17th. Then for the SWIFIA program, letters of interest submissions are due on September 15th. And then it should take us, the WIFIA program, 30 to 60 days approximately to review all the LOIs and to go through the evaluation process. And then we will publicly announce the selected projects, hopefully by the end of 2020, in the later part of 2020. In the past, selected projects were given advance notification prior to the public announcement date. Next slide. So, as I mentioned, the process is kicked off by EPA publishing the NOFA in the Federal Register. The NOFA is a really important document because it provides key information specific to the funding round. It includes how much money is available, this case $5 million. Again, the opening date and deadlines for funding, July 17th to September 15th of this year. It also includes key information on the evaluation process, the factors for selection as well as the weights assigned to those selection factors, and detailed instructions for submitting the LOI, which you need to follow in order for us to deem your LOI validly submitted. Next slide, please. So the type of credit assistance we offer under the SWIFIA program, again, this is separate from the base program, but under SWIFIA, for this $5 million of appropriation, we are offering senior parity loans. The maximum amount of credit assistance will be 49% of the SWIFIA project, i.e. the portfolio of projects that are submitted in the LOI. Prospective SWIFIA borrowers can request that we either adopt the SRF's existing capital markets document, such as an indenture or a resolution, or the SRF borrower can accept EPA's standard terms and conditions. Next slide, please. Here are some additional standard terms that must be accepted or that are part of the SWIFIA program. If for some reason an SRF did not like any of these terms, they could always apply to the base program where there's a bit more flexibility. So for SWIFIA, at least 90% of the SRF's existing and future principal and interest repayments must be pledged for payment of debt service for the WIFIA loan. The minimum debt service coverage ratio is 1:0, as well as the coverage test for the additional bonds test. WIFIA will not be requiring a debt service reserve account under SWIFIA unless it's offered to the SRF's other lenders. Debt service payments can be annual or semi-annual. WIFIA will have standard reporting requirements similar to what's in the base program, and delivery of annual audited financial statements, notifications that would typically be filed in EMA, SRF annual report, etc. And then finally, when SRF loans in the SWIFIA project are prepaid, so the sub-loans, if you will, within the broader SWIFIA project for a particular SRF borrower are prepaid, and the prepayment does not adversely impact the overall cash flow or the debt service coverage numbers for that borrower, then those excess funds resulting from the prepayment can be used by the SRF borrower for new loans rather than to use them to pay down the loan back to WIFIA. Next slide, please. We will also consider in reviewing the letters of interest is the SWIFIA project, the SRF's project bundle, is readiness to proceed. If the bundle is ready to proceed to construction within 18 months of the LOI deadline, which is March 2022, it will be considered for the SWIFIA program. Next slide, please. Letters of interest are available on the WIFIA site, which is a part of the larger EPA site. You see the address there on the screen. Please use the form that is up to date and available on the website, not any older forms. The sections in the form include loan information, supporting documents, contact information, and several certifications. In the loan information section, the prospective borrower provides its legal name, address, website, DUNS number, employer identification number. It will also indicate its requested loan amount, the estimated total cost of the SWIFIA project, and whether the projects are clean water SRF and or drinking water SRF projects, as well as its requested loan structure. For supporting documents, the SRF should also provide the most recent version of its IUP, intended use plan, its operating agreement, documentation of the priority setting system, and its capital markets debt instrument, if that's applicable. Contact information, self-explanatory. The prospective SRF borrower will identify its point of contact with whom the WIFIA program should communicate regarding the LOI. To complete the EPA's review of the LOI package, the WIFIA program staff may contact the prospective borrower regarding information in the LOI. So it's important that the contact details in that section are accurate and represent a good contact should we have questions. And then finally, in the certification section, the prospective SRF borrower certifies that will abide by all applicable laws and regulations, including NEPA, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, the American Iron and Steel requirements, federal labor standards, among other requirements. And it will certify that it will comply with those if it is selected to receive funding. Next slide, please. When completing the LOI form, please follow the instructions that you see on the screen. All responses should be in the editable Word form and submitted as a Word document. It is not necessary to provide a cover letter or cover page to the form or to reformat the document in any way. For our internal reviewers, it's much easier to locate the information quickly when the form remains unchanged. The total completed form should not exceed 50 pages. All relevant supporting documents should be provided as separate attachments. There is no page limit to attachments, and attachments may be preliminary or draft documents. They do not need to be in final form. Finally, signature pages must be submitted as a scanned document. Next slide, please. Please read the instructions carefully in the NOFA and the program handbook prior to completing your LOI. The program handbook is available on our website. Please answer every question in the LOI and please provide all requested supporting materials. If you have any questions, please contact us at the phone number and or at the email address on the screen. Please note you can ask us clarifying questions, but we cannot provide technical assistance for completing your LOI. Next slide, please. Again, deadline submission is September 15th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Late submissions will not be accepted under any circumstances. All LOI submissions should be submitted electronically through our SharePoint site, which is preferred and is also easier for providing large attachments, or you can also submit it at our email address there on the screen. To be granted access to the SharePoint site, please contact WIFIA at epa.gov and request the link to the SharePoint site, and in there you can upload your letter of interest as well as all of your attachments. Again, doing this on the SharePoint site is our preferred way for receiving your LOI package. There is no fee to submit a letter of interest, and we will notify you when we receive the LOI, your LOI. Thank you, Karen. Project selection is a competitive process to identify projects that will then be invited to apply. Projects must be eligible, creditworthy, feasible, and help EPA and the WIFIA program to meet its mission. Letter of interest evaluations are completed by the WIFIA program staff and as needed with support from our colleagues in the Office of Water, as well as from contractors that work with the WIFIA program. Next slide. With respect to eligibility screening, the first step in the LOI review process is to check for baseline eligibility. We check for four main things: whether or not the prospective borrower is an eligible entity, whether or not the project is an eligible project, as was described earlier, and as further described in the NOFA as well as in our program guide. The anticipated project cost must be $20 million or more, and the requested loan must be 49% or less of anticipated eligible total SWIFIA project cost. If a prospective borrower or its project is found to be ineligible, we will notify the point of contact listed on the LOI as soon as possible. Only eligible letters of interest will move on in the review process. With respect to some recent legislation that was passed in a House committee, as some of you may know, there is additional screening criteria that has been added as part of OMB's review of potential projects and prospective borrowers. This OMB screening criteria is new for fiscal year 2020. And for this, the borrower is not required necessarily to submit any additional information. EPA is required to answer a series of questions about each LOI submitted and submit the responses to OMB. If needed, EPA or the WIFIA program will reach out to the borrowers on an individual basis if additional information is needed beyond what is provided in the LOI. The goal of the questions is to screen out, and the criteria is to screen out projects that would be considered a federal asset as determined by OMB. On this slide is a list, and on the next slide, I believe as well, is a list of the statutory selection criteria that EPA must include and review when evaluating the LOIs. The extent to which the project financing plan includes public or private financing in addition to assistance, the likelihood that the WIFIA assistance would enable the project to proceed at an earlier date, the extent to which the borrower uses new or innovative approaches, the amount of budget authority required to fund the WIFIA loan, the extent to which the project serves regions with significant energy exploration, development, and production areas, the extent to which the project protects against extreme weather events or helps maintain or protect the environment, the extent to which a project serves regions with significant water challenges, the extent to which the project addresses identified municipal, state, or regional authorities. Next slide, please, Karen. The readiness of the project, as I mentioned before, and the extent to which WIFIA assistance reduces the contribution of federal assistance to the project. And then next slide again, please, Karen. The next step in our process is the preliminary creditworthiness assessment. The preliminary creditworthiness assessment has two purposes: to evaluate whether the credit assistance has a reasonable chance of repayment and to estimate the amount of budget authority necessary to fund the project through a WIFIA loan. The prospective borrowers and projects will be assessed for creditworthiness by looking at the financial risk factors and the business risk factors. For financial risk factors, the WIFIA program will consider the applicant's financial strength and risk, such as weighted average default rating, default tolerance, and credit enhancements. For business risk factors, the WIFIA program will assess the strength of the applicant based on factors such as portfolio size and diversity, portfolio concentration, management experience, and operating history, and financial policies, procedures, and internal controls. Next slide. The LOI review process will also examine, have a preliminary examination of any underlying capital market debt instruments that the prospective borrower indicates in their LOI that they want the WIFIA program to follow in its loan. This review will focus on identifying any elements that will preclude the WIFIA program from accepting the SRF's capital markets instruments, such as an indenture or resolution. The review includes the flow of funds and how any excess cash flow is used by the SRF, reviewing the additional bonds test, the coverage requirements, the security in place for the protection of the senior debt, as well as defaults and remedies. Next slide. For the SWIFIA program for fiscal year 2020, all eligible SWIFIA prospective borrowers will be invited to apply for a SWIFIA loan. If based on this standard that all eligible SWIFIA borrowers will be invited to apply, if this results in the SWIFIA program being oversubscribed, then EPA will allocate the available amount of financing among interested prospective SWIFIA borrowers on a pro rata basis based on the financing request outlined in their letter of interest. Next slide. For example, if the EPA has $1 billion available for loans in fiscal year 2020, and in this example, the EPA receives a request for 2 billion loans. If State A requests 500 million, State B requests 600 million, State C requests 400 million, and State D requests 500 million, as you see in the table, for a total request amount of 2 billion, then using the prorated formula that was discussed on the last slide, State A would be invited to apply for 250 million, State B 300 million, State C 200 million, and State D 250 million, which represents a percentage of all requests, hence the prorated amount, if we are oversubscribed. Next slide. The WIFIA program will provide written notification indicating the amount that the prospective borrower can apply for when submitting an application. If a prospective borrower declines EPA's invitation, EPA would reallocate to other eligible prospective borrowers to the extent practicable, or carry the funding forward to a future round. And again, EPA will also publicly announce any selected prospective borrowers. Next slide. So in summary, prospective borrowers whose projects are selected will move to the second stage of the application process, project review, negotiation, and then hopefully the final stage, which is closing. Unlike project selection, where every prospective borrower is on the same schedule, the schedule for project review, documentation, and then closing is dictated by the borrower's need, and the amount of time needed to turn around the documentation and for both the borrower and the EPA to get approvals. The following schedule, the schedule on the slide, is a general example, but it does vary from borrower to borrower. Borrowers have up to 1 year to submit an application. However, we encourage our selected borrowers to apply as soon as possible. Generally, the application evaluation, which includes credit, technical, and legal due diligence, takes up to 3 months. There is little to no negotiations in SWIFIA. However, it will take time to create the documentation for the term sheet and loan agreement, up to 2 months. Internal approvals at EPA involve approvals involve not only the borrower's approval from their internal stakeholders, but also on the EPA side, we need to obtain approval from the EPA administrator, the Office of General Counsel, and then as well as the Office of Management and Budget. This can take up to 3 months. Next slide. Each application review is tailored to reflect the complexity and risk of the proposed project. Each project is reviewed for creditworthiness, engineering appropriateness, and legal aspects of the proposed project and credit structure. Next slide. The application fee is currently $100,000, and it is required to be paid at the time of application. This $100,000 is used as essentially a down payment for the cost of WIFIA hiring external advisors to review the application. Next slide. EPA also requires reimbursement for engineering, financial, and legal advisors hired during the application phase. The fees for these advisors, the cumulative fees for these advisors range between $250,000 to $300,000 or potentially more, depending on the project's complexity. Fees that may be part of your credit assistance, not including finances, solely related to obtaining WIFIA credit assistance. The fee is not dependent on the size of the project, but the risk or complexity. For the first 5 loans in the base program, the fees range between 0.04% to 0.31% of the loan amount. Next slide. The preliminary credit rating letter must be submitted with the application. It must be a public rating letter from at least one nationally recognized statistical rating organization. Suggested contents include the proposed loan structure, revenue pledge, estimated coverage ratios, and key assumptions and limitations. WIFIA may consider accepting an existing rating letter in place of a new preliminary rating, but this is determined on a case-by-case basis. Next, thank you. For the final rating letter, as Karen mentioned before, only one is required now as part of issuing of the WIFIA loan. The public rating letter must also be from an NRSRO that assesses the default credit risk. The WIFIA loan must achieve a rating of investment grade or above. A rating letter may include terms and conditions of the WIFIA loan features, the plan of finance, the revenue pledge, collateral, potential loan covenants, and credit risk and mitigants. And now I'll turn it back over to Karen to discuss the resources and to open it up if we have time for questions.
Thank you, Courtney. So I'll just, before we go to questions, I just want to walk through the resources that we have available to prospective borrowers. So as I mentioned before, this webinar, was specifically based on the SWIFIA program. If you're interested in learning a lot more about the WIFIA-based program, I strongly encourage you to register for one of the 2 upcoming webinars. The same material is going to be presented twice, first on July 28th at 2 Eastern Time, and then again on August 11th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And registration for both of those webinars is available on our website. I'll also take the time to mention, we always get asked and I always forget to mention, we did record today's webinar for the SWIFIA program, and we will post it on our website so people can listen to it. And we'll also post the slides as soon as we can, and we'll do that for the base program webinars as well. I just also wanted to mention that we're happy to meet with you. EPA will meet with all prospective borrowers interested in discussing the program prior to their submission of a letter of interest. So if you want to talk to us before you submit your letter of interest, please send a request to wifia@epa.gov. Given that everyone's working at home, we can do our meetings either by video conference or by phone. We limit the amount of time you can have with us to 1 hour. During that time, EPA can answer clarifying questions, but we can't provide technical assistance in terms of helping to fill out an LOI. One of the other things I think specifically for State Infrastructure Financing Authority borrowers, we can use that time also to talk in more depth about the differences between the base program and the SWIFIA loans. If you're kind of trying to figure out what makes the most sense for your situation. In addition, our website, we hope, is incredibly helpful to prospective borrowers. We have general information about both the WIFIA base program and the SWIFIA program. We have a bit of information about the benefits and then just kind of the laws, links to the laws and regulations that we are bound by. In addition, we have the application materials, and specifically, if you scroll to the bottom of that page, you can find the SWIFIA letter of interest form and application. And then we have other resources. We have a program handbook, which we did recently update to include chapters specifically about SWIFIA. We have the template term sheet that I referred to earlier, which has the standard terms that SWIFIA borrowers would accept. And we also have a standard term sheet for the WIFIA-based program. And then we have more information about federal compliance requirements. And then just want to reiterate that we're happy to talk to you anytime. You can reach out to us. We monitor very closely our WIFIA at epa.gov mailbox. So someone's always looking at that to make sure we're answering questions. We also do program announcements, and so we encourage you that if you're interested in kind of following what's going on with WIFIA and SWIFIA, to sign up at the URL on the screen. So I saw that we had questions coming in, but unfortunately, because of the webinar software, it's a little bit tricky for us to look at the questions and pay attention to the slides. So Courtney and I are going to just take a minute to look at the questions. Feel free to keep writing them in, and then we'll start answering them in just a minute or two.
Karen, I can take a question here that was asked by Stephen.
Okay, great.
So the question here, I think it's a two-parter. It says the minimum project funding is $20 million, question mark. So a $1 million water or wastewater project isn't eligible, question mark. I think it was not clear, and perhaps we need to clarify the slide for next time. When we talk about the project, the SWIFIA project, it's not talking about the individual sub-projects. When an SRF borrower applies to the program, they are applying to fund a suite of projects. That suite of projects is what we call the project or the SWIFIA project. And any of the individual projects within that suite of projects will be called the sub-project. So $20 million is looking at that project bundle that the SRF for which the SRF is applying for WIFIA loan to fund.
Thanks, Courtney. Here, sorry. So we have a question on that asks sort of how will the $5 million result in $1 billion? Sometimes I like to say it's magic, but it's really just the way federal credit works. And so what the agency is required to put aside from their appropriation for the loan is really kind of it's really to cover the risk of default. So since loans to the water and wastewater industry in general are low risk, and in particular SRF programs have shown a long history of financial stability and a strong credit history, we think there's a very, very low risk of default. And so as a result, we can just take a small amount of appropriation and make a much bigger loan. The rest of the money comes from Treasury and then is repaid directly to Treasury. So unlike the state revolving fund programs, WIFIA is not a revolving fund, so we require an appropriation each time. So when a loan is paid back, that money goes right back to Treasury. Hopefully, it's actually a very think it's very hard to kind of explain how it works. It's a bit of a confusing process, but it's something that it's how federal credit programs are set up, and there's lots of other federal credit programs, kind of most notably student loan programs that work in a similar way.
So then I see a question here. I see a couple questions here, excuse me, here that in different ways ask about combining funding from different federal sources to fund a project. And Karen, you may have to, actually, Karen, maybe you would be better at addressing those questions actually than I would.
Yeah, so I see one that says, can the proceeds from a SWIFIA loan be used to fund an SRF loan for a project that is also receiving a WIFIA loan? And this is, you're not the first state that's asked this. So the answer, we were actually just looking into it. So the answer to that is no. You cannot combine the proceeds from a SWIFIA loan with the, you cannot do use the proceeds of a SWIFIA loan for a project that is also receiving WIFIA funding. It would violate kind of the caps on how much money we have in the project in the statute. There's another question of, can a SWIFIA loan be used to fund a project that already has received an SRF loan and has already started construction, but still has 49% of the project left to disperse? I think that's a good question. So the way we're thinking about this is that, and so I may not answer this directly, but just kind of more generally, for the SWIFIA program, at the time of letter of interest, we are not asking for a list of projects yet. And we're doing that for a few reasons. One, because potentially an SRF might request, a SWIFIA loan of $500 million, and we might come back and offer one of $300 million. And so, it would require a lot of adjustments to the list. And maybe it seems like a lot of potential work up front that might not be worth it. And then I think the other reason is at least with our initial loan to IFA and with other loans that we've done for bundles of projects, we've seen that list kind of can change rapidly, and it's easy, kind of later on in the process is a better time to put a solid list together. So we're asking for that list at application. And so I think at that time, it probably depends more on not one individual project, but kind of the group of projects that are included together, in terms of which projects can be included. The one thing we are asking is that all the projects start construction within 18 months of the LOI deadline, which would be, September, which would be, so from 18 months from September 15th. But in terms of projects that are already under construction, I think it would be hard to say if it was under construction now, kind of where it would be when that list was done. And that's something, that list and the discussion about what can be included is sort of worked out with the underwriter at application.
So I see a question here. It says, do projects that receive SWIFIA loan proceeds have to comply with the Single Audit Act? I believe the answer to that is yes. Actually, no, I'm sorry, I'm thinking about that at a different level. The SRF, I assume, would need to comply with the Single Audit Act as the recipient of the WIFIA loan. I don't think that trickles down to the individual borrowers, basically the borrowers of the SRF, but I'm not 100% sure of that.
Yeah, I would agree, Courtney. I think that's right, that it would be, any requirements would be on the borrower, but we can follow up with that, it would be our borrower, which in this case would be the state, the SRF program or the Infrastructure Financing Authority, and then that requirement would not trickle down. But we can double check that. Did we get up to all of them?
There's a longer question towards the top that came on at 2:08. I'm not sure if we can address that. It's pretty nuanced. But while you look at it, I can address this one question that came in about the 90% revenue pledge number. Okay. In this question, it says that, I believe on the slide where I said that one of the standard terms is that 90% of debt service payments received by the SRF needs to be pledged as security for the SWIFIA loan. And the question is, does that apply to the SRF's entire portfolio of projects or just the projects funded by SWIFIA? And the answer to that is the latter. It's the entire portfolio of the SRF's projects. And the assumption in that statement is that the SRF is a capital markets debt issuer, and under that structure, there's a single indenture, and under that single indenture or resolution, they issue all of their capital markets debt, and so all of their debt holders, bond holders, are accessing the same collateral package. Now, if for some reason, and this happens sometimes, the SRF's capital markets debt structure is such that they essentially issue separate indentures or separate series of debt documents every time they do an issuance, that's going to be a little bit different and a little bit more nuanced than just a straight 90% across the entire debt stack. So I hope that gives you a bit more clarification.
Yeah, and I'm gonna, there's a question from Marlene. I'm gonna say just sort of a more general answer, but it's a really specific question about kind of a specific situation. And it really kind of is more for it would be a loan more that would be under the WIFIA base program. But I would just encourage you or anyone else who has specific projects that you're questioning the eligibility. One of the things we can do in WIFIA in general is look at a written project description and give you a determination of whether it is eligible or not. So to do that, you just kind of write a description of the project, maybe like, between a half a page to 2 pages, depending on what makes sense or what you already have, and provide it to us. And then we can look, it doesn't have to be, we can look before you do a letter of interest and say whether or not that would be an eligible project. And you can just send that to wifia@epa.gov. And then I saw some questions. Let's see. Can SWIFIA loans pay for green infrastructure projects, hybrid green-gray projects, or just gray projects? The SWIFIA loans can pay for any types of projects that are eligible for either the clean water or drinking water SRF programs. And within those programs, green infrastructure projects are eligible for funding. So I will at sort of a national level. So I think the difference is in this case, the loan would go to the state, and for some reason the state has some sort of restriction on what they can fund, that would kind of carry through. But otherwise, yeah, it does not just have to be gray projects. It could be green-gray projects or green infrastructure. Let's see. And there's also a project. Does the total project cost have to be over 20 million or 40 million, with 49% being funded by SWIFIA? So the total SWIFIA project cost has to be 20 million or more, and then the loan would be 49% of that. So in a case where there was a $20 million project cost, the loan would be just a little bit less than $10 million. And I think, Courtney, that's all of them that I see.
Says, can projects in the LOI include both clean water and drinking water projects together? the answer to that is yes, right, Karen?
Yes, it can. And it really, I mean, a lot of it really depends on how the state is structured, but yes, it is allowed from a EPA perspective.
And I see a question here. It says, can the loans fund additional subsidies for disadvantaged communities? I'm not sure. I'm not sure the answer. Yes, what I can say is that, and this is in the program guide. I don't remember if we had an actual slide on it, but there's a specific list of what is deemed eligible project cost, and it is those types of costs, and they're typically more related to kind of the design and construction of capital assets, but and kind of the fees that go along with it from the consultant, the various consultants used for the project. Those are typically the types of costs that we reimburse. I would need a little bit more information to definitively say whether or not we would fund additional subsidies.
Yeah, so there's not sort of, so I guess the question is, yeah, that's a tough question. I mean, so the SRF would have to repay the full amount. So I guess whether or not you wanted to include additional, I don't think it makes sense. But yeah, we can get back to you and think about that a little bit more. But there is no kind of additional subsidization that comes with the SWIFIA loan. We don't have the same authority that SRF programs have to do loan forgiveness or principal forgiveness or grants. Is there anything else? I feel like I am not seeing all the questions that you're seeing, Courtney. So if you see anything else.
I don't see anything else.
Okay, so with that, we'll end today's webinar. Thank you for joining us today. As I mentioned, we will put a recording of this webinar as well as the slides up on our website shortly. If you, for some reason, want the slides sooner, feel free to reach out to the email address wifia@epa.gov, and feel free to keep asking questions and reaching out to us as needed. So I hope everyone has a great day, and hopefully I'll be talking to some of you soon. Bye-bye.